Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody this evening. Oops, Gina, my picture is okay. All righty. All right, everybody, welcome. It's great to have you here this evening. My name is Jeffrey Lamia, and for a short while this evening, I will still be president of the AIA's New York Society. And so it's a pleasure to have everybody here. We have a lot of events. We have a roster of events this evening. So I think it's about time we get started. And let me share my screen. And I will start with my slideshow. Oops. Cancel that. Start the slideshow from the start. Okay, can everybody see that? Thumbs up, I hope. Yep, great. So we have three things this evening. It should be actually quite interesting. The first thing we'll do is every year we have an annual meeting, and we have some things to be done, which I'll talk about. Then, quite excitingly, we have a presentation on the Fieldwork Scholarship that the New York Society has awarded, and then we'll move into our lecture. This evening's agenda for the annual meeting, which I'll call to order, is I'll start off with my president's report about what we've had over the past year, followed by a treasurer's report, then some elections, some changes to the New York Society bylaws, and then some other business, and then we'll adjourn. So to get started, my report. Obviously, this past year, we've had 7 lectures. As is usual, the New York Society, mirroring the National, we cover literally all kinds of cultures and periods. And so all of these have been webinars, given the COVID and everything else that has happened. So those were quite successful. I've also mentioned in previous meetings and other lectures about our New York Society Scholars Program. We've had 3 cohorts, and the last of 2021-22 season, our cohort number 3, we awarded 6 New York Society Scholars Awards. They get free membership in the AIA, and they get a whole range of other benefits, including the ability to apply for our Fieldwork Scholarship. The cohort number 4 this year is now in process, and you'll be hearing more about that in future meetings. We awarded back a few years ago, we actually dispersed our Fieldwork Scholarship, a $1,500 scholarship, to our first cohort, lady who went to Greece and worked in Crete. However, because of COVID, and therefore a lot of cancellations of fieldwork opportunities, we held off awarding our Fieldwork Scholarship for cohort 2 and 3, which we did finally disperse this year. And cohort 2, you heard the last lecture we had, the young woman who participated in an Etruscan fieldwork experience gave a report. And tonight you will hear about a young woman, young archaeologist who are from cohort 3, who will be talking about Peru. Cohort 4 applications will be due at the beginning of 2023 and will be awarded in April of this year. You should also have received our fall 2022 newsletter, which had all of our forthcoming lectures for this fall season, as well as other information and articles about the New York Society and about our other activities. In January, we will obviously send out another paper newsletter, which will have details of all of our forthcoming lectures and announcements about the winners of our cohort number 4. So stay tuned. One thing you can always do, by the way, if you are a member and haven't received your paper newsletter, please send an email to www.aia-newyorksociety.org, and we'll get you a copy of the paper newsletter. But you can always go to our website, as you see on the screen, for registering, seeing under the events, to see the various lectures that are coming. And if you click on those forthcoming events, you can register. So we've had a very full year, and more exciting details to come. Right now, I'd like to turn it over to John Yarmick, who will, bear with me a second. I will let him, there we go. So John, I will make you a co-host, or I think I'm going to be able to make you a co-host.
Jeff, I think I can share my screen.
Okay,
anyway.
Here we go. All righty. And I'll be back.
Oh, no, I can't. So you'll have to make me a co-host.
Co-host, yes. Okay. I'll make
Sorry.
you a host. That's all right.
I thought I could.
There you go, John.
Okay.
There you go. All righty. You can take over the screen.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Jeff. Hopefully you can all see my financial report for the fiscal year that ended on August 31st. And as you can see from this report, we ended this fiscal year with a slight deficit, which is actually unusual for us. We normally end the year with a slight surplus, but the main reason for the slight deficit was, as Jeff noted a few minutes ago, we dispersed 2 scholarships this year rather than just 1. So you can see in the New York Scholars Program, a rather sizable expense. That was a 1-year event. This fiscal year and moving forward, we will hopefully only be dispersing 1 scholarship a year. And so that will normalize that. A couple of things just to highlight. We did see a drop in our friends' contributions. Some of that was unfortunately due to some of our friends passing, but also we think that some of our friends who enjoy the social contact that comes with being a friend, that was missing during our COVID years. This year, Heidi is going to be introducing more in-person events. So we're hoping that that will give our friends, traditional friends and new friends, the incentive to give us their contributions again. And remember, contributions are fully tax deductible as we are a nonprofit organization. The good news about, or if we can say it, about our Zoom lectures is that it results in significantly lower expenses in the lecture programs. Last year, $955, the year before, $1,900. In prior years, when we had in-person lectures, it would have been 3-4 times that amount. So as we move ahead, if we reintroduce, and as we reintroduce in-person lectures, we will certainly want to watch that. The other expenses are more or less in line with what we've had year after year. I will draw your attention to the fact that we do have an endowment trust. It was doing very nicely. It's invested by AIA in Boston on our behalf. Of course, with the downturn in the markets, we had quite a sharp drop in the value. We did not take a draw because we elected to fund the deficit through our own savings. We have, as you can see, still quite a lot in our savings account, 44,000. And given that the small size of the deficit, we felt right now for this purpose, let's just tap into that and leave it at that. So those are really all my comments for this fiscal year. I should mention this is the last report that I will be giving you as I have stepped down as treasurer after 10 years doing this. And Pam Crabtree has agreed. She is an archaeologist and a professor at New York University. She has agreed to take on the treasurer responsibility. She has a good deal of experience in this for another organization that she was involved in. So she will be delivering next year's report. So that's it, if anyone has any questions.
If you have questions, you can put them in the chat, or there's another way of doing this, which is down on your lower right in the bar, there are reactions. And if you click on that, you'll see various options, and you can put a thumbs up, for example. If you hit on the thumbs up, that it'll appear beside your picture, and that would be a raise hand. You'll be able to see that kind of thing. So if there are no questions, then thank you, John.
You're welcome.
And we will move on back to my presentation. Bear with me a second. I have to get rid of my raise hand. Lower hand. Okay. So back to the shared screen and my presentation. Okay. The next order of business are our elections and how to vote. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, you will see, bear with me a second, you should see at the bottom of your screen a reactions. Hopefully, do you see that in the bottom? No? Boy, all righty. Let's see here. Now I think I'm at a loss. I guess what I would say is, oh, we've got trouble. So,
No, it's there.
oh, it is there.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And you can click on that, and you can put thumbs up or hand raised, and that will show up in your screen, and I can monitor that. So that's really the issue. Going back. Oops, no, I need to go back. Okay, back, whoops, down here. There we go. Okay, so today we're going to vote on for the president, treasurer, and general trustee. For president, there are term limits for everyone, and it's my presidency, like others, there are term limits, 2 successive terms of 3 years each. So my terms is actually up as of this meeting, this annual meeting. And there is a nominee which comes to you as a motion, and it's Antonis Kotsonas, who is currently a general trustee, and he's associate professor of Mediterranean history and archaeology and director of graduate studies at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU. And obviously you can see his PhD and his other credentials below. He's a very noted scholar and throughout the Greek world. So we are very fortunate that Antonis wants to step up and become president. So as I said, this comes to you as a motion. Could I have a second, please?
I second.
Thank you. And so is there any discussion about this at all? All in favor, please hit your reactions with the thumbs up. Okay, excellent, 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 great. Okay, thank you very much. And I guess I would say congratulations to Antonis. And there he is there. Okay. So moving on then, as John mentioned, John has served, as you can see, he was served faithfully as our treasurer for many years and has been serving in the interim. But as he mentioned, we have a new nominee. Actually, she's been performing the job because the board approved her. But we did do a search before that and decided that she was the best candidate for us. And as you can see on the screen, as John mentioned, noted professor at NYU in the arts and sciences, a zooarchaeologist, and she has served as a treasurer of a national zoological organization. So again, this comes as a nomination. This comes as a first nomination. Do I have a second for that, please?
Second.
Thank you. And so I would say we're going to hit again. All in favor? Please raise your thumbs. Okay, I see a lot of thumbs. Great. Okay, thank you. So we'll say congratulations to Pam. So moving on, we have a new trustee for a general trustee. And before I mention to that, the nominee which comes to you is Timothy Pugh, who is a professor of anthropology at Queens College of the City University of New York, CUNY, and also a professor at the Graduate Center at CUNY. And you can see his credentials on the screen. His area of expertise is Mesoamerica and Mayan culture. In fact, the last lecture, he gave us a lecture about his field work and the excavation he's been working on. As I've mentioned in other contexts, the New York Society, like the AIA National, does cover all cultures and times and periods. So we on the board really do appreciate having both New World, Old World, Asia, and other kinds of general trustees. A faithful trustee, Terry Daltroy, is stepping down. His term ended. He worked in the New World in Peru. And so having Dr. Pugh join the board would be really important. So could I have a motion for that?
I move.
Can I have a second, please?
I second.
Thank you. And all in favor, please, let's do our thumbs up again. Okay, there's a lot of thumbs up. Great, excellent. All righty. I guess we have a new trustee, which is great. Thank you very much. Moving on, we have some bylaw changes. The first one, which you see up there, is to establish a new board position, past president. And the rationale is, the idea is to smooth the transition, and keeping a person on the board with a vote as past president would help in that regard. It would be 1 year, not renewable. And really, this mirrors what's done at the AIA National. And as the outgoing president would move automatically to this new position. The last piece of it is just an article to recognize that the president can remove the past president. And this is true for the treasurer and other positions as well, by a 2/3 vote of the governing board at a special meeting. So that just adds that particular thing. And I think it really would help to smooth the transition. So that actually comes to you as a first nomination. Do I have a second for this, which comes as?
I second.
Thank you. Now, if there's any discussion, you can raise your hand and I would recognize you. Without any discussion, whoops, there we go. Oh, no, that's just another admit. Okay, I would ask again for people to go to reactions. Thumbs up, if you would. It looks like we're getting lots of thumbs up. Oops, I lost my cursor here. 1 second. Thumbs up for everyone. Okay. All righty. Thank you. Moving on, we have, oops, we don't need this. This is the specific wording, but the next is to change one of the articles. And basically, all this does is just clarifies the process by which filling of vacancies. And just the idea that any vacancy filled by the president would have to be confirmed at the next meeting of the governing board. But it does add the fact that whatever is confirmed by the governing board at their next meeting would then have to be confirmed at the next annual meeting of the society in general. Bear with me a second, sorry. The other vote, and we'll do two of them together, is to change another article and basically just adds the word president in terms of receiving information and for processing, and it reflects current practice. Instead of it going to the secretary to receive nominations, et cetera, it can go to the secretary or the president. And so both of these actually reflect current practice, and they both come to you as a motion. So could I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Is there any discussion about any of these? You can always hit thumbs up or something and I'd raise a question. Then without further discussion, I'd ask everybody to please go to your reactions with thumbs up. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate all that. And I think now we go on. Oh, yes. Normally in the meeting, we do an approval of the previous minutes. I will be sending out the minutes, or Paul Zimmerman, who actually is now in the field in Iraq working. But when he returns, we will send out the minutes of the last meeting and ask for comments and approval by our members. So with that in mind, I'd like to move on to the Fieldwork Scholarship. And so I would ask, turn it over to Joanne Spurza, who has been the key person responsible for leading this effort. Joanne? You need to unmute.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you for your years as president. And thank you to John for his years as treasurer. And before the introduction to our presenter, let me just say a quick word to any faculty in the audience. Again, we hope that you'll nominate a student for the next cohort of NYS scholars. The deadline is October 24th, and all the information is on the website. Very simple, straightforward procedure, 3 parts: a nomination letter by a faculty member, a short personal statement by the nominated student on their interests, experiences, and career goals in archaeology, and then an electronic transcript from their academic institution. And this covers applications from sophomores, juniors, seniors, first-year graduate students. All the information, as I say, is on the website, and we really look forward to an avalanche of applications on the 24th of October. And now it's really my great pleasure to introduce our 3rd scholarship recipient from the 3rd cohort of the AIA-NYS Scholars for 21-22. Illyamani Castro is an Ecuadorian American archaeologist who received their bachelor's degree at NYU, graduating with honors with a thesis on human migration in the Andes, pre-Hispanic colonization. Currently, Illyamani attends the University of Florida for their master's program in Latin American studies with a focus on archaeology and indigenous studies. So far, they've worked on sites in Ireland, in Ecuador and Peru, mostly in ceramics and human bones and zoo archaeology. Currently, they're working on gender-based burials in the pre-Hispanic Andes. But now we will hear about the summer experience. So Illyamani, let me turn things over to you.
Cool, thank you for the introduction. Hi everybody, yes, my name is Illyamani. I will be talking about Peru if I can get the thing to share? I think I can. Hopefully it's sharing now. Oh, wait, no. Can everybody see? Is it okay? Cool.
Yep.
So over the summer, I worked in Fadi, Peru, with two people, Dr. Bebel Ibarra and Dr. Jason Nesbitt. Fadi was really the town that we stayed at for the most part, but the actual sites were a little farther away from the town. So one of them was Ampas, and that was working with Dr. Ibarra. That one was around like 13 to 14,000 feet altitude. So the first couple of weeks, it was kind of rough, but you know, you get used to it. We found so many amazing and like really cool things. We found human bones. They were mostly adult and I think 1 or 2 fetus bones that we discovered. They were all found in these chulpas. So for those who don't know, chulpas are these tombs specifically found in the Andes. And sometimes they contain bones, other times, if we're really lucky, intact ceramics. It really depends on the area, the altitude, if there's any looters nearby, any historical looting in the past, etc. So we found a lot of cool stuff there, including intact ceramic, which we were super grateful for. On the other hand, I also worked with Jason Nesbitt in Japarin, and that was mostly because I couldn't handle the altitude too well in Ampas, but you know, it happened. That one was also around 12,000 to 13,000 feet, and we mostly worked on a lot of walls architecture. When we were doing a lot of digging, we kept finding more and more walls. So we were trying to figure out like, is this a potential house that we found, or is this like a ceremonial site? Because we also found different types of like what's it called? Like geology, like different rocks, charcoal, things like that. But we didn't find any bones, and it was mostly just ceramic shards, but no intact ceramic. We also found a lot of like decorative wall artifacts. And they were attached to the wall, but eventually, you know, because we're digging, they just fall off. But we still kept them, and we have them currently with the Ministry of Culture, I believe, in Lima for analysis. And yeah, the orange circles is 2 different places that we worked at. I also have Huaritambo up there because we did go visit the site, which is really cool. And the photo is of, I believe, Huari. So what we found in Ampas, as I said, we were really lucky to find a lot of ceramics completely intact. We also found decorative ceramic and decorative wall artifacts there as well. On the very left, you can see one of the chulpas where we did one of our own. Bebel Ibarra, he's a native to Huari. So we have like, or they have like a specific ceremony that they do for archaeologists, especially for newcomers. Basically giving offerings to whatever spirits are in the mountains at the moment, and hoping that they give us safety and grant of passage, essentially. So that was really interesting to witness. I really loved the entire field school. It was really fantastic. We worked on a lot of shards, as you can see on the bottom left. There are so many ceramics that we found that sometimes it's like a little difficult to figure out between rocks and ceramics, but it happened. And yeah, so on the right, you can see all of the intact ceramic pieces that we found, including another chulpa that we managed to dug up. That chulpa turned out it wasn't looted, which is why we still have the intact ceramic. And you can usually tell when they're looted because if we find more shards, then the implication is that people have uprooted the rock that's supposed to stabilize it, and the chulpa eventually caved in on itself. As for the upper right, that was one of the things that we worked on the most, which was drawing the stratigraphy of the locations. So it was a little bit more complicated because we were kind of like on a hill because the chulpas are stacked on top of each other. But eventually we did make it work because we had like this really long rope that we could use to accurately determine where to put the points for the stratigraphy. Yeah. And I didn't include any of the bones mostly because I know bones are a little complicated and controversial to put like for photography, so I didn't include them, but we did find a couple of little bones. In terms of Japarin, we mostly found ceramics. Japarin is a little bit more, how do you put it, protected because it's still a new site and we didn't want any looting to happen because it is unfortunately very common in Peru. One really cool thing that we did find though was this little cave, I guess you could say. We haven't really found too much inside of it besides some ceramic shards, We did find a little dip at the very end. So I hope you can see my mouse, but over here where the lighting is kind of like blue. So we found that, and then in the second photo, the purple circle, that's where we found the cave. And the blue circle is where we found all of the other wall artifacts. So from what we could find in just the short 3 weeks that we had, we did uncover like a good amount of the wall. We definitely know it's not Inca because for those of you who don't know, Inca walls tend to be very well organized, very straight blocks. But in this case, they weren't straight blocks. So we're thinking maybe like before Wadi, because Wadi also started developing straighter blocks. But we're still not sure yet because we haven't been able to do deep analysis yet, as far as I'm aware of anyways. As for the activities that we did, as I said before, we did a lot of ceramic and shard drawing, which is really interesting. And on the left, you can see my hand. We found like this pigment, if I remember right, it's ochre. And it was like a little heart shape with that, which I thought was really cute. So we did a lot of identification, inventory, cataloging, a lot of ceramic drawings. The requirement is that we have to do 20 drawings per, like 20 different artifacts and 20 different drawings. And we also did cataloging for bones. In this case, I did include the bones because these were not from this specific site. It was from a previous site that Babel had already worked on. And these were already cataloged within the Ministry of Culture in both Huaraz, which is a little bit to the left of Wadi, and Lima. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I just want to say thank you to everybody, to the AIA Society for letting me be able to do this. And of course, to Pam Crabtree, who is, I'm very close with her, and she was pretty much my mentor during my time at NYU. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Illyamani. You probably should get out of your screen, I guess. There we go. Okay. So again, everyone, hopefully you can see me. Thumbs up. Great. Good. Now actually it's time to move on to the lecture. Thank you, Illyamani. That's very nice. Again, I would just say to everybody, we really appreciate your membership. And if you're not a member, please join. The New York Society is a vibrant society supporting students in their archaeological studies. And as I mentioned, the last lecture we had a young lady who spoke about her fieldwork experience in the Etruscan area. And now we have something in Peru. And it's really important because a lot is learned in archaeology through fieldwork experience. So thank you for your membership. If you're not a member, please join. If you have any questions, go to www.aia-nysociety.org and ask a question. All righty, so let's move on now, and I will turn it over to one of our general trustees, Gina Tibbett. Gina, why don't you take it away?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Gina Tibbett, and echoing Joanne, I first want to thank Jeff and John for their many years of service to the New York Society. And for tonight's lecture, I've really been looking forward to this. I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Allison Elsie Emmerson. Professor Emmerson is a Roman archaeologist who specializes in the study of cities. She is particularly interested in the marginal aspects of ancient urbanism, not only literal city edges and the activities they attracted, such as waste management and the treatment of the dead, but also the people who have been marginalized, both in ancient life and modern reconstructions of it, including women, the enslaved, and the sub-elite. Dr. Emmerson completed her BA at Denison University and her MA and PhD at the University of Cincinnati. She then held a visiting assistant professorship at Indiana University's Department of Classics before moving into her current role as Associate Professor of Classical Studies at Tulane University, where she also acts as the Director of Graduate Studies. She is a Fellow of the American Academy in Rome and the American Council of Learned Societies. Her first book, Life and Death in the Roman Suburb, was published by Oxford University Press in 2020 and was awarded the Archaeological Institute of America's James R. Wiseman Book Award in 2022. Her forthcoming books include a publication of excavations at Pompeii's Porta Stabia and fieldwork in Isthmia, Greece. She has published widely in peer-reviewed journals, including the Journal of Roman Studies, the Journal of Archaeology, and the Journal of Roman Archaeology, in addition to book chapters and book reviews. Dr. Emmerson has presented her work widely, including many AIA annual meetings and society meetings. Dr. Emmerson has extensive fieldwork experience throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. She was a trench supervisor and field director for the Pompeii Archaeological Research Project Porta Stabia, where she now works as the co-head of publication. She is also part of the publication team for the East Isthmia Archaeological Project in Isthmia, Greece. Currently, Dr. Emmerson directs the Pompeii 114 project, an excavation that examines the development of the city prior to the catastrophic eruption of the 79 CE eruption, focusing especially on issues of social interaction and civic infrastructure. And so with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Emmerson.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'm so happy to be here this evening. I might need to be made a co-host to share my screen. Oh yeah, it looks like I do. Oh, I think it went to a different Allison. The joys of technology. There, yeah, that should work. Okay. Can everyone see the screen? Great. Well, thank you again. Thanks for that kind introduction, Gina. Thank you, Jeff, for the invitation. Thank you all for hosting me this evening. I also have to extend another special thanks to Gina Tibbet, your trustee. You're going to see a series of quite nice, I would say, maps and plans throughout this presentation, and Gina drew all of them, in case you didn't know that she was an archaeological illustrator. So credit to Gina for the maps. Here we go. So I'd like to begin tonight with a door, or more specifically with two messages that were scribbled onto a door some 2,000 years ago. At face value, these graffiti aren't really all that special. They're simply two of the many greetings that were left on Roman walls. These are written in charcoal, and one, the lower and larger example, which greets a certain habitus, was at some point scribbled out. If we zoom out, however, these start to get a little bit more interesting, because this particular door was nothing other than the door to a tomb, now poorly preserved outside Pompeii's southernmost gate, the Porta Stabia, but once of the altar type that's best known from examples to the north of the city at the Porta Ercolano. The greetings left on this tomb were in no way different from those spread across the city. They were scratched everywhere, from the lofty atria of elite homes to the squalid latrines of bars and shops to the columns of grand public buildings. These examples attest to the traffic that flowed past the monument and appear in no way affected by the cremation urns arranged in benches, just on the other side of the plastered door. Today, they serve as a good reminder that Roman tombs were not set aside in quiet cemeteries, as is most common in modern cities. Tombs were spaces for the dead, but they were part of the landscape of urban life, and in their own ways participated in the encounters and relationships that brought Roman cities alive. The research I'll be presenting today is part of a broader project aimed at understanding the cities of Roman Italy. As Gina said, my interests generally tend towards the marginal, towards the people, the activities, and the spaces that receive less attention in modern scholarship, but which are also less evident in the evidence that we use to make our reconstructions of the past. When we think of ancient cities, we typically picture a concentration of life and activity with a clear and clearly defined border. We can see Here, if we look at the slide of Pompeii, that there was a very clear border, in this case, a city wall. That is the case for most cities in Italy. Outside the wall are the tombs of the dead, their location dictated by longstanding laws that forbade interment within the city itself. Both the existence of such laws and the archaeological evidence from sites like Pompeii have given rise to the idea of a strict separation between the living outside, or the living inside the wall and the dead outside it, giving rise to ideas like a sort of city of the living inside the wall and a city of the dead beyond it, a sort of shadow twin that in some ways is dark or dangerous or inverts the standard order of urban life. Today, and here's the spoiler warning, I'm going to argue against that reconstruction. Roman cities could and did expand outside their formal boundaries, creating neighborhoods that incorporated both the living and the dead, neighborhoods that I refer to as suburbs. Over the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to present several case studies, focusing on when and, more importantly, why suburbs developed, before finally coming around to the most important question of all, which is what new information this gives us about the Romans, particularly regarding their relationship with the dead. To begin, let's stay put in Pompeii. We're going to turn from the Porta Stabia on the southern side of the city to the Porta Ercolano to the north. This is one of the most beautiful places at the archaeological site. As you can see from the photograph, it's leafy, it's green, it's peaceful and quiet. After a hot and dusty tour through the city center, this makes a fantastic place for tourists to stop and rest. The zone is dominated by the ancient highway that cuts a straight line northwest towards Herculaneum, framed on either side with tombs, many dedicated to some of the city's most prominent families. For this reason, the area is usually referred to as the Porta Ercolano Necropolis or the Porta Ercolano Cemetery. But those titles overlook other aspects of the neighborhood. In fact, just looking at this photo, you might notice on the left side, that is here, a structure that once consisted of a long portico, fronting a complex of shops. This has now been reburied, but it was excavated in the 18th century, so the mound that we're looking at here is backfill from the excavations of the late 1700s. We might be able to see more clearly on the plan, which shows that at the Porta Ercolano, far more space was dedicated to the living than it was to the dead. Let's zoom in just a little bit. In addition to the reburied shops we just saw, those are the ones highlighted now on the screen in blue. As you can see, we don't fully understand the plan of these shops, but we at least can have an idea of what their facades were like. There's also a much better understood complex of shops to the north, complete with staircases leading up to what were likely rental apartments above. Another commercial complex of especially large shops stood east of those, and several smaller spaces might also have hosted retail. As is the case inside the wall, what these shops sold usually is unclear, but two had masonry counters indicating that they served as fast food restaurants, or what we might call taverns or bars, that is in the Italian sense rather than the American sense. And notice that one of these had a bench outside, that's the one pictured on the screen, where clients could enjoy the food that they had just purchased. The bumper stones to either side of an entrance to another space suggest that it might have been an inn or a stable originally. These stones project or protected the pillars from the wheels of carts, but its function had clearly changed prior to the eruption because a curb and sidewalk had been put in place over what were once ramps leading up from the street. Another shop, recently excavated by the École Française de Rome, had a clearer function in 1789. It was certainly a pottery studio. I know that's of interest to a few people here, where pots were being dried on the very day of the eruption of Vesuvius. And here's just a better look at that studio, which actually spread over the space of 3 separate shops. The neighborhood also hosted 4 large villas, the so-called Villa of Cicero, Villa of Diomedes, Villa of the Mosaic Columns, which is still only partially uncovered from the eruptive material of Vesuvius, and another 100 meters up the road through unexcavated land, the famous Villa of the Mysteries. Like neighborhoods inside the walls, it featured infrastructure to support all of this activity, including a public fountain shown here, and a street-side shrine for propitiating the local gods. Unfortunately, this last had already been destroyed by the early 19th century, but earlier drawings and watercolors show that it featured typical iconography. Here we see a snake approaching a platform on which offerings could be left. In this case, the platform was formed by a tile projecting from the wall. Now, of course, I am not the first to notice all of these spaces for the living mixed among the tombs of the dead. They are pretty immediately evident. But I do disagree with their standard interpretation, which has tended to stress 2 points. The first is that this area was once a quiet cemetery, but eventually the city's population grew to such a degree that it was somewhat begrudgingly pushed outside the wall, since land inside had become fully saturated. The second point is that once this passive and in some ways reluctant outgrowth had happened, the spaces for the living sought to deny the nearby tombs, almost to pretend that they didn't exist or that they existed on some separate conceptual level from the buildings around them. This interpretation of urban overspill sees the continuation of a strong conceptual separation between the living and the dead, even if they were no longer physically separated. So following this line of thinking, the operators and patrons of the bar here at the Porta Ercolano, which shares a wall with a tomb, would seek to deny that connection, and if they could, ignore the tomb next door. This reconstruction has long seemed problematic to me for a couple of reasons. Continuing to think specifically about Pompeii, the idea of urban overspill really doesn't quite fit. Parts of Pompeii were densely developed at the time of the eruption of Vesuvius, but others, especially on the eastern side of the city in regions 1 and 2, were not. In fact, since the Augustan period and up to 79, these blocks had grown continually less dense, with earlier townhouses destroyed to make way for market gardens. The chronology of development at the Porta Ercolano also introduces questions. Due to the density of later buildings, we don't know much about the area in the pre-Roman period. The only evidence we have are a few non-monumental tombs dated to the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, both those shown here on the plan and others that were found in early excavations below the Villa of Cicero, as well as in the area of the Villa of the Mosaic Columns. The Villa of Diomedes and possibly the Villa of Mysteries and Villa of Cicero are best placed in the first half of the 1st century BCE, along with a very small number of monumental tombs, at least one of which, that is number 3 on the plan, was later supplanted by further development. These were built along a single highway that ran slightly north of the final paved road. The real boom in development came in the Augustan period, by which point the Villa of Cicero certainly was in place. The roads were reorganized into their final form with a fork some 100 meters past the gate, and both the Villa of the Mosaic Columns and its large commercial complex had been added. A small number of monumental tombs also can be placed in this period, especially in the area just outside the gate. But the vast majority of those appeared only in the Julio-Claudian and Flavian periods, squeezing into open lots left in the midst of this other development. Notably, the neighborhood of the Porta Ercolano undertook its key phases of growth at the same time that neighborhoods within the wall were de-densifying, suggesting a more complex situation than the standard interpretation of urban overspill. Likewise, the common idea of development forced into a cemetery also doesn't seem quite right. This was a neighborhood in which buildings dedicated to the living and those devoted to the dead grew alongside one another. They grew together. So what do we see in other Roman cities of the time? No other Roman suburb preserves as much evidence as that outside the Porta Ercolano, but other sites can provide us with some further context. Probably unsurprisingly, one of these is the next best preserved Roman city, after Pompeii, and that is Ostia, Rome's port at the mouth of the Tiber. Ostia was an absolutely massive city, much bigger than Pompeii, and it had a much longer history, not having been destroyed in the middle of its urban growth. Today, research is concentrated inside its late Republican city wall, surviving parts of which you can see indicated on the plan. But bringing together excavation, aerial survey, and geophysical research has shown that this city was once far more extensive than the modern archaeological park. What we're looking at here is the excavated area in red and yellow, the major highways in red, and additional known but unexcavated urban development in black. Note that this development spreads not only across the plain to the south of the city, that is through this area, but also extends to the north, slightly less known here, but clearly continuing, both over on the right bank of the Tiber and on the southern end of Isla Sacra, the man-made portion of land, or excuse me, I guess the man-made separated portion of land. They didn't make the land, but they separated out with the canal that you see here, which separates Ostia from Portus. And some excavation and survey that's been done outside of Portus shows that it too reached southwards across Isla Sacra towards Ostia. We should note also that even this great extent of the city is somewhat limited by the extent of available surveys. It seems extremely likely that Ostia extended actually even beyond what we're looking at here. Obviously, there's still a lot we have to learn about this city, but the limited zones of excavation within some of these areas that are found outside the walls, the most extensive of which are at the Porta Marina to the west, the Porta Romana to the east, and the Porta Laurentina to the south of the city, show that they included tombs integrated with other types of urban structures, that is shops, houses, workshops, apartments, temples, public buildings, etc. As interestingly, what little chronological information we have points to the Augustan period as the decisive phase in this development, just as for the neighborhood outside the Porta Ercolano at Pompeii. The remains that have been cleared outside Ostia's Porta Marina, for example, help to make this point. By the end of the 3rd century, the area was densely developed, tightly packed with temples, baths, and other public buildings, which are shown here in red, villas, houses, and apartments, highlighted in green, and shops and workshops, which are here in blue, as well as 2 tombs, which are showing up on your screen in yellow. Most of this development, like that throughout Ostia, dates to the 2nd century and later, the time of the city's final urban boom. But nestled among these buildings is evidence for an earlier burst of development, best dated to the Augustan period. Notably, both of the surviving tombs belong to the end of the 1st century BCE. The tomb of Gaius Cartilius Publicula, shown on the right, survives as a marble podium with the epitaph surrounded by bundled rods carved in relief and a frieze of a naval battle above. The dedicatee was a magistrate who had served as duumvir of Ostia 8 times, that is really a lot, so this is a very important guy, and he'd also been local censor 3 times. The tomb's been dated to the final quarter of the 1st century BCE, and we can get an idea of this date just by noticing the difference between its level, especially its lower podium. So we should imagine ground level somewhere around the bottom of this photo, and the level of the final, most likely 4th century road that runs past it. The second tomb still standing at the Porta Marina was larger and closer to the gate. It was decorated with marble revetment and featured 3 benches, 2 curved examples that framed a larger pie-shaped bench. Some fragments of decoration suggest that its upper element might have taken the form of a circular colonnaded temple, a tomb type that's usually known as a tholos. Although no epitaph survives to record its dedicatee, its size, location, and decoration all suggest that it was dedicated to a citizen equally as prominent as Cartilius Publicula. It is at roughly the same elevation as the other tomb. Again, this is a little bit tough to judge, but it likewise appears to be best dated to the late 1st century BCE. And today, these are the only buildings in the neighborhood that can be placed so early, but some limited subsurface excavations suggest that they once stood alongside other contemporary structures, possibly tombs, but given the situation at Pompeii, equally likely to have been meant for the living. Short stretches of walls at similar elevations to the tombs have been found across the neighborhood, including in one instance, adjacent to the tomb of Publicula. More evidence for Augustan period development in this neighborhood comes from the Porta Marina itself, or more accurately, from its absence. Already by the early 1st century CE, the gate structure had been removed entirely here, and what we're looking at are the remains of the lower courses of the gate with later development above. In the Augustan period, the gate might have been replaced with a freestanding arch set several meters outside the line of the city wall, although the existence of that arch remains subject to debate. We're on firmer ground with another infrastructural item of the Augustan period, a coastal levee that was erected along the shoreline. The levee further attests to development at the time, since presumably it was meant to protect a growing neighborhood outside the gate that remains today largely hidden below the final buildings. At this point, you might rightly wonder whether suburban development was exceptional and limited to Italy's largest and most successful cities. Ostia, of course, was entirely atypical with an absolutely massive population, maybe as many as 100,000 people, although, of course, counting here gets a little tough because levels of migrants and transiency were probably quite high. The city's connections with both Portus and with Rome also set it aside from standard modes of urbanization in Italy. While nowhere near the size of Ostia, Pompeii too, with a population that's probably best placed around 15,000, not to step into a very hotly debated topic, but we'll be moderate there, was definitely a lot larger than the typical city of Italy in the early imperial period, where we might expect a population of about 5,000 to have been more typical. For that reason, I think Fileri Novi is the best place to go next. This was a town of perhaps 3,500 or 4,000 people, located in the Tiber Valley about 50 kilometers north of Rome. Today, most of the site remains underground, although the city's impressive fortification wall still stands, framing an 11th century church and surrounding agricultural land. The lack of later urban development at the site has created a perfect opportunity for exploring Fileri Novi through ground-penetrating radar. Over the past 2 decades, projects of the British School at Rome have revealed Fileri Novi's plan in enough detail to make it one of the best mapped urban centers in Italy, rivaled only by Pompeii and Ostia. As you might notice looking at this plan, the work has also revealed something that is of particular interest to my project, since Fileri Novi's urban development extended outside its wall to a plain north of the city. Today, the concrete cores of several tombs still stand in the open fields of this area. In antiquity, however, a true suburban neighborhood stretched past the wall, home to funerary buildings, but also to the city's small amphitheater and more quotidian structures, which appear from the geophysical and aerial data best defined as shops, workshops, gardens, and at least one villa. Notably, as at Pompeii, this neighborhood developed even as open spaces, some of which might have been under cultivation, were maintained inside the wall. At this point, it might be enlightening to turn to my full data set. No other Roman cities are known as completely as Pompeii, Ostia, or Fileri Novi, but reviewing evidence for sites across Italy suggests that suburbs were the norm and not an exception. In fact, all of the sites mapped on the screen demonstrate the presence of both tombs and other urban buildings outside their fortifications. Questions remain. In some cases, we just don't know enough to say whether the data represents just scattered buildings or true dense and diverse urbanization. But the pattern appears widespread enough that we should begin rethinking that definition of Roman and especially Italian cities being spaces that were tightly defined by their city walls. Moreover, I think that even this map could be misleading. The clusters that we see here, such as in the Bay of Naples, along some key highways, and across the Cisalpina in the north, reflects where the most work on Roman cities has been done. Basically, where cities have been studied beyond their monumental centers, suburbs turn up, and I expect the phenomenon to have been even more common than the map communicates. Furthermore, and as interesting as the sheer ubiquity of suburbs, is their shared chronology. Now, I will say there's a big asterisk next to the sentence because there's still a lot of work to be done here on the chronological data, but where it is available, it all points undeniably to one key moment of growth, and that is the Augustan period, the era of Rome's first emperor. The urban boom that came with the rise of Augustus has long been known and studied. What this work makes clear is that the boom extended not just through city centers, but also outside them. So why do I think suburbs appear at this precise moment in Italy's urban history? The first reason is probably the simplest and the most closely related to traditional interpretations of neighborhoods like the Porta Ercolano at Pompeii or the Porta Marina at Ostia. That reason is demography. Urban populations unquestionably did grow in the late 1st century BCE and the early 1st century CE. Italy appears to have attracted more people in general in those decades, but specifically to have drawn more people into its cities. This is one factor. But of course, as I've already pointed out, it doesn't make sense as the only factor, or even the most significant one. Densification of the city within the wall was an available option, but many cities instead expanded outside. And we might think here of Pompeii, where houses were being demolished to make market gardens inside the wall at the very same time that the city was growing outside it. Suburbs are not inevitable or passive offshoots from urban growth. Like all aspects of the city, they were shaped by active choices. That point leads us to our second factor, which is security. Italy's security following the consolidation of power into the hands of one man opened up new choices and new possibilities for urban form. Following the brutal civil wars that marked the end of the Republic, Italian cities had less need for their walls. This is the second factor that has received some attention in past scholarship. Again here, however, I would urge some caution. On the one hand, we might question the necessity of defensive walls already in the decades between the social war and the rise of Augustus. The most widespread dangers of the period were not military, but political actions against which walls provided little defense. And here I'm thinking of threats like proscriptions or colonial foundations. On the other hand, we might ask how residents of Italy processed the security of the time. From our perspective, we know that Italy would remain relatively stable up to the year of the 4 emperors in 69 CE, but presumably that was much less evident to the contemporary population, especially considering the traumas that they had suffered leading up to the establishment of the Principate. For these reasons, I think we need to go a little bit deeper, past demography and security. And now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of what I see as the most significant factors in the rise of suburbs. The first of these is prosperity, the sheer amount of money that flowed into Italy, and especially into Italy's cities during the Augustan period. This is what funded that urban boom, a sudden burst in local investment into infrastructure, into major public monuments, into dedicated and often specialized retail spaces. The suburb was an ideal place to add these types of structures. It had clear value as a landscape for display. The suburb was the first part of a city a traveler encountered, and in some cases, for those on longer voyages, the only part of a city they encountered. It was also an ideal place to make commercial investments and retail that could market to residents of the city itself, as well as to travelers. As often happens, the construction of this time, in both center and suburb, turned money into more money and fueled a rapid increase in social stratification, growing the divide between rich and poor. This situation created a new pressure on and desire for elite housing, which in the more open and likely cheaper land of the suburb could grow even bigger and more elaborate than it could in the city center. Prosperity is an absolutely inseparable from the next factor, which is competition. All of this wealth funneling into Italy created a new degree of competition between elite families who were doing more and more to ornament their cities. But political changes under Augustus also brought a fundamental change in scale to Italian politics. In this period, Italian elites joined the equestrian and senatorial orders in Rome in rapidly increasing numbers. Suddenly, they were competing not just on a local scale within their own cities, but on a regional and even peninsula-wide scale. In the Republican period, when the stage was more local, elites focused on construction in the city center, especially in and around their city's fora. As they moved into state-level politics, the suburb became an ideal location for public works that spoke to a larger audience. This point is also dependent on the next. The Augustan period infrastructural improvements made travel around Italy easier and safer than it had ever been before, while consolidation of power in Rome and an increase of Italian presence in central government made it more necessary. Even as they competed among themselves, Italy's cities were more connected in this period than at any point in the past. This creates an odd phenomenon. The competition of the time had the ultimate effect of making Italy's cities incredibly similar, outfitted with the same stone-paved roads, the same public theaters and amphitheaters, the same porticoed sidewalks along long rows of shops. Even as they grew out of competition, These urban features spoke to a shared culture and community. They were an essential part of the mental shift of the period, away from seeing Italy in terms of its individual regions and cities, and into seeing it as a united whole. But there is one last point that I think we must touch on here, and that is the form of Rome in this period. When we think of Rome, we often picture it like this. The Aurelian Wall of 270 CE is so essential to the concept of the city today that it even dictates how much you pay for a cab from the airport. But in the period under consideration here, Rome did not look like this. It looked something like this. Rome at the beginning of the Augustan period was a city still officially bounded by its old Republican wall of the 4th century BCE, here indicated with a thin dashed line. For well over a century, however, it had been breaching and expanding past that wall. Literary, legal, and archaeological evidence all suggest that by the end of the 1st century BCE, dense urban development extended beyond the wall by more than a mile in some areas. Along several of the major highways, the city might already have surpassed the line of the later Aurelian Wall, which would be erected 3 centuries in the future. Unfortunately, we face some particular problems in trying to understand Rome's ancient form. Outside the monumental center, where more recent development has been cleared away, our view of the city is limited to tiny keyholes of excavation, usually dictated by modern construction, and that's in a city that sees extremely little modern construction at a subsurface level. For this reason, one recent project is incredibly valuable, being exceptional both in its large scale and in the care taken in its excavation and publication. The work was carried out along the modern Via del Tritone, outside the Republican Wall and about 400 meters east of the Via Flaminia. It was conducted as part of the total redesign of a 19th century palazzo to host the high-end Rinascente department store. The construction was extensive enough to allow for the full clearance and excavation of a zone of around 4,000 square meters, which is absolutely enormous by the standards of urban archaeology in Rome. The work revealed a complex neighborhood running alongside the Aqua Virgo at the confluence of 2 roads. The earliest recovered remains here were, we should notice, Augustan, although nearly all of the first buildings had been supplanted by later structures of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, when the area was dominated by a series of so-called insulae, the mixed residential and commercial rental units that were standard for mid-imperial Roman urbanism. These buildings remained in place into the 5th century CE, at which point parts were restructured into an elaborate mansion and bath. Those remained in use through the 6th century before being abandoned in the 7th. Importantly, through all of these centuries of development, the living were not the only residents here. Preserved throughout the entire history of the neighborhood were 3 tombs, all belonging to the 1st century CE and all retained in the midst of extremely dense urban life. The neighborhood of the Via del Tritone leads us to the final, and I would argue most essential of the factors that dictated the growth of suburbs. That is, the establishment of a new urban ideal in Rome. As I said, by the Augustan period, Rome had long since outgrown its old fortification wall, but even so, that wall remained its legal boundary. Augustus changed this. Although the wall retained some traditional functions, including as a limit for tombs, the Augustan reorganization reconceived the city as 14 regions that included more extramural than intramural space. Some regions even crossed the wall to include both intramural and extramural areas. This act served to better structure the expansive city of the period, but it had an equally important symbolic role. Essential to Augustan propaganda was the idea of city, empire, and peace without end. The open Rome of the Augustan period embodied this notion of a Roman power that stretched on without borders, and as importantly, without fear. In developing suburbs outside their own cities, Italian elites not only brought those cities closer to the image of Rome, but also echoed and created the Augustan worldview of settlements that reached towards one another, threatened neither by their neighbors nor by foreign powers. The neighborhood along the Via del Tritone reminds us of the role of tombs in this urban vision. Even as the structures of the 2nd century and later supplanted and erased the buildings of the 1st century CE, including at least one earlier tomb, 3 funerary monuments were maintained through all phases of development here. Surviving elements suggest that these were memorials of particularly elite Romans, partially explaining their active preservation as part of the living neighborhood. We see here, for example, the epitaph of a consul from the Pomponia family and a fragment of a frieze showing bundled rods. The situation is similar at Ostia's Porta Marina, where 2 tombs of elite citizens were maintained, even as the rest of their neighborhood was wiped away by later urban development. The Porta Marina, however, was in many ways Ostia's front door, suggesting that these tombs served as a type of public monument to the city's past and explaining their preservation. The Via del Tritone was different, since it was removed from any main routes into or out of the city. A closer comparison might come from another part of Rome, the Emporium district. This was one of Rome's first suburbs. It urbanized already in the early 2nd century BCE, as the city outgrew its old harbor at the Forum Boarium. In the first half of the 1st century BCE, a tomb was added to one of the main routes through the zone, dedicated to the prominent consul and local landowner, Servius Sulpicius Galba. More than 3 centuries later, when Rome was mapped on the Severan urban plan, the tomb was still standing, squeezed between the shops and warehouses of this busy port district. We know that contemporary tombs were destroyed by later development here. The 1st century BCE tomb of the Rusticelli, for example, was buried under Monte Testaccio. So why was Galba's tomb preserved? One answer might come from his fame, as well as from the development of the area on his family's estate. But records from 19th century excavations provide another clue. The neighborhood had 2 main monumental zones, featuring clusters of statues dedicated by the local magistrates known as the Vici Magistri. One of these clusters was at a building that consisted of a single room lined in benches, believed to be the headquarters of that group. The other cluster is more interesting for our purposes. It was located nowhere else than at the tomb of Galba. The dedications surrounding the tomb suggest an active reimagining of the monument over successive generations. That is, they attest to its transition from an individual's funerary monument into a local memorial and point of neighborhood pride. The tomb survived in a dense urban environment, not simply because Galba was an important figure of the past, but because those who lived and worked nearby continued to interpret his memory as relevant and meaningful to the community's life, a message that was reinforced with each new addition to the tomb site. Some residents might have felt a personal connection to Galba. For example, a freed member of the Sulpicii Galbae set up a statue at the tomb around 2 BCE, while Sulpicius was the most common nomen attested among the known Vici Magistri from the district. Such individuals, who were non-elite but actively engaged in local politics, had clear motivation for maintaining the tomb and honoring its founder as a means of bolstering their own status. Even those without such clear ties to Galba, however, might have felt connected to his monument. Surely many residents lived and worked in and around the warehouses constructed by Galba's family, the Horia Galbana, which you can see just behind the tomb on the map, while the Severan marble plan suggests that the area retained the toponym Praedia Galbana, at least into the 3rd century. Like the tomb of Galba at the Emporium, the tombs of the Via del Tritone were tucked away, probably not part of the monumental suite of the city. They're more likely to have functioned as local than as public memorials, maintained over as many as 5 centuries, even as contemporaneous buildings disappeared. This situation does not suggest a neighborhood that denied, ignored, or otherwise conceptually separated tombs for the dead from buildings for the living. Rather, it seems to embrace its tombs, incorporating them into its urban space. At Pompeii, indications remain of similar processes. We might note, for example, how the portico outside the shops on the northern side of the street outside the Porta Ercolano frames the tombs to the south, creating a pleasant atmosphere that encouraged shoppers to linger and, in antiquity, just as it is today, was good for business. We should also pay attention to how many benches were incorporated into tombs here, further attesting to a life and activity that flowed between the spaces dedicated to the living and those for the dead. To me, it does not seem coincidental that this neighborhood, at least based on currently available evidence, was both the most commercialized suburb at Pompeii and hosted its most elite collection of tombs. Here, tombs and shops came together to create a busy and prestigious space where, had it not been truncated by the eruption, we might expect urban development to have continued building upon itself, encouraging ever more activity on behalf of both the living and the dead. To conclude briefly, let's go back to that door. The graffiti left here on a funerary monument outside Pompeii's Porta Stabia does not attest to a separation between the living and the dead, or to a strict division between a city for the living inside the wall and a city for the dead beyond it. Instead, these greetings represent the integration of monumental tombs into urban space. In short, I see the Roman dead not as excluded from the urban community, but as an essential part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. If there are questions, please type them in the chat and Allison will be glad to answer them. While you are putting your questions in the chat, let me ask Allison, so if, and is it correct then, that the initial prohibition of burying the people within the city walls, if that was the case and religiously driven, putting aside various other mythical ideas, then your talk suggests a change in literally in social thought with respect to, so that they looked at the old taboos differently. And if that's correct, shouldn't it appear somewhere in written literature of some kind?
Yeah, so I actually don't think it was ever a taboo. I've gone back and primarily I can look at this only for the city of Rome itself. It gets more complicated when you want to look out into Italy because there's just not as much data. But looking at the earliest remains from Rome, every place where there is settlement in early Rome, there are tombs there too. So there's been a longstanding idea that you still see repeated very often, that the original settlement of Rome was up on the hills and the tombs were down in the valley. But the evidence shows that to not be the case whatsoever. There are buildings for the living down in the valley and there are tombs up in the hills. All these settlements were all mixed up. Once we get from then on, you have from the 6th century, Rome starts to urbanize, and there are tombs mixed in the urban area. Of course, at that point, you didn't have a city wall to differentiate where the tombs could be and when they couldn't. When it comes in the 4th century, there's still tombs of the 4th and 3rd centuries that are showing up inside the city wall. So I think the reason why we see this law repeated so often is because people kept breaking it, which to me doesn't suggest that there's a taboo. It suggests there's something else driving it, because the Romans are so reactive in their laws. Their laws are completely reactionary. If there's a Roman law about it, I tell my students it's like my syllabus. If it's in there, it's because it's been an issue, and maybe because it's been a repeated issue. So I think we can see that Romans often were burying inside the wall. And I think the original law is both sumptuary. So it actually shows up when we see it in the 12 tables. It shows up in a list of sumptuary regulations that are intended to curb elite competition, which was leading to violence in early Rome. So I think this is a way to kind of move funerals outside of the political center of the city and curb spending on funerals by trying to put them out. And then of course the elite respond by starting to do more and more elaborate funerary processions. So doesn't quite work, but also it keeps land clear in the center of the city, because at least in theory, definitely not in practice, but in theory, any land with a tomb on it for the Romans is inalienable and cannot be used for any other purpose, can't be transferred, can't be sold. So it makes sense from a perspective of urban design to move the tombs outside the city to make sure that people aren't taking over land that could be developed inside the wall with tombs.
This would be exciting. I mean, this would be a major reinterpretation.
Yeah, I really, so I mean, this whole project started because I thought about the idea, the very standard idea in Roman studies, that the Romans feared the dead and feared death pollution. And as I worked on a dissertation on tombs in Campania and went through necropolis at Pompeii and other cities, I just kept thinking, it's so strange for a culture that fears the dead that there are so many other buildings in these necropolis. What am I missing? What am I not making sense of? So after I finished my dissertation, when I had suddenly the glorious freedom to do something that wasn't directly related to it, I sat down and read the ancient sources. I went back to all of the citations that I always saw listed for the Romans fear death pollution. I went to the Latin, I went to the Greek, and I found really nothing that pointed to death pollution. So I have now published that as an article in Journal of Roman Studies that came out, I think, 2 years ago, in which I argue that death pollution is a late antique idea that gets projected back on earlier Roman history.
Has there been much of a reaction to the article?
For the most part, people have been receptive of it. It came out in the middle of COVID, so it's hard with the things that came out in COVID time because there hasn't been much chance to talk about it. We haven't had an AIA meeting. All of these things happen virtually. So I hope that I hope to be able to discuss it more with people, especially because I'm an archaeologist and that article is almost entirely text-based. So I'd love to especially talk about it with philologists.
Right. So I don't see any questions in the chat. Please, folks, if you have something, type it in the chat. It's I enjoyed your presentation very much. It was really fascinating, I think. If there are no other questions, then I would say to thank our speaker. It was, I thought, a very exciting presentation for sure. And we'll have to follow what, oh, there we go. Oh, great lecture. Thank you. Okay. Please keep in mind that our next lecture by Dr. Michael Cosmopoulos will be on November 9 on Wednesday, again, starting at 6. Michael will be talking about his work at Icklina, which I've worked analyzing the pottery of Icklina, Mycenaean site, where it's, to my knowledge, the only non-Megaron palace where they found Linear B. So makes it really interesting. And Michael is a very noted scholar. So thanks everybody for joining tonight. And I'll call a formal end to the lecture. And again, for me, this is my last job as president. It's been a pleasure to serve for 6 years. And I'll look forward to my time on the board as past president. So take care of everybody.